Hi everyone, and welcome to my God Demon Hunter guide for Diablo 3 Season 29. This is one of the overall best farming builds in the game. It is super smooth to play, super fast, and very beginner friendly. So as you can see here, you basically just strafe around and everything dies around you like automatically from those hanging arrows that the set fires out automatically as you do that. So you basically hold down the button, you press your cooldowns whenever they're ready, and then here and there you shoot a hanging arrow to give you the momentum buff. But in Season 29 there was actually a buff to the set that now you keep the momentum buff much more easily. There's a 5-second delay before momentum starts decaying, so you only have to press your generator once every 9 seconds roughly. So it is very easy and very laid back, optimal to jump into the season and gear up your Demon Hunter. And in this video I'm gonna talk through the setups, through the core combos, the set, the stat priorities, the skills, and everything you need to know. And the Season 29 with the Paragon cap brings a bit of a consolidation to the different variations. Some setups are not playable really at those Paragon levels, or just not really reasonable. So it is actually much easier to gear than usual as well. Let's jump in. I have the updated planner here. I also updated the maximum guide for this build as well, so you can also go read up on that. What you need to know is, if you have played this build before, aside from the buff to the momentum mechanic, is that Guardian set is king this season. So usually you only use it on like very low Paragon levels, because as you gain more and more main stat from your Paragons, Guardian set becomes worse and worse compared to other options. But with the cap at 800 in Season 29, this is basically included in all variations in this build, and also in many other builds. Then we have the main set, the God set, the Gears of Dreadlands, that gives you this strafe and hanging arrow combo. So the way this works is that you have this momentum stack that you can see on the buff bar, those 20 stacks, this is the momentum. And when you fire a generator, you will get those momentum stacks. And then they start ticking down slowly from there. Each stack of momentum gives you more damage for your generators and more movement speed. This set gives you 160% movement speed by default. This is why you are so fast strafing around at lightning speed. And then whenever you hit a target with your strafe projectiles, you will fire out your generator. So this is how you deal all the damage. It's not the strafe, it's the hanging arrows in this build. So you start stacking up multipliers for example, the Death Daggers. You have the Simplicity Strength, and you have Hunter's Wrath and Knife Series Satchel. So this is big multipliers for Hanging Arrow. Especially Quiver is very important here. This is like by far the strongest piece. And once you have that and the set, you're gonna be destroying G16, Greater of 90s. You can farm all the way up to like 110s even or so with this setup once it's a bit optimized, even 115s I think. But in Season 29 that will not really be needed. Greater of 90 is where it's at. You just want to go fast, as fast as you can, in order to gear up your Demon Hunter, because Paragon grinding is not going to be a thing, and this build is optimal to just blitz through those greater rifts. As you can see here, you can do like 1-minute runs, 90-second runs. You can even do like way faster than 1 minute on a good map, and this is how you gear up your Demon Hunter without the need to grind the Paragons. So the God Demon Hunter is superb for this purpose, because of this movement speed buff, because you deal damage while moving as well, and you see that it's a breeze. In your solo push, on the other hand, there are way better builds than this. So you can see this here, it kind of hits like a brick wall at certain levels. So after like 130 or so, it's gonna get real rough on this build, because it doesn't really have big AoE potential. Those hanging arrows, they only pierce 3 targets, and that's it. So if you have large pools of enemies, you don't really deal a lot of extra damage like other builds do that can just hit the entire screen, for example. So while it works really well when you just blast for everything, it is kind of weak going towards the higher tiers. And for example, Natalia Demon Hunter or Marauder Demon Hunter push way higher. So this is something to keep in mind, but it can still push into the 130s, even up to like 140 I would say, on the higher end, with like a really good run. But it is not really as smooth and as easy to do, because now you have to play around, for example, Squirt's Necklace, you have to try to not get hit, and you have to also make really good calls on which enemies to fight and which enemies to skip. In any case, I can walk you through the different setups here. So there are some push variations and then the solo speed farm variations, T16, etc. It's all in the planner down here. and they are generally quite similar. So in addition to the set and the Guardian set and the other multipliers, there are a few different weapon choices. So for example, the standard choice here is Valor's Bequest. This makes that strafe projectiles pierce. This is what most people do on the more casual end. You play with this weapon. The main reason why you want to use this weapon and what it does is, as I mentioned, it's not the strafe that does the damage. So even if the strafe projectiles pierce, it doesn't actually directly affect the hanging arrows. So you don't actually deal more damage from this weapon. However, first of all, you get an extra stat. It has 5 primaries, as you can see. And those piercing strafe projectiles allow you to trigger slightly more hanging arrows. Basically what happens is there is a cooldown on how many of those hanging arrows can be triggered. And then depending on how much delay there is after the cooldown has finished until the next strafe projectile hits a target, you can get more or less hanging arrows. And what this weapon does is that it lowers the average delay between the procs, basically. So you get slightly more hanging arrows. It's not the strafe itself actually doing anything. The same goes, for example, for the Baritza. So we have a crossbow set up here for a solo push. This is also what I think is going to be really powerful, maybe even better in this season. You can just wear any crossbow, or you can also wear the Baritza. And the same story here, the projectiles pierce 2 additional times. This does not actually apply to the hanging arrows. Instead, it applies to some of your strafe projectiles, and you get slightly more hanging arrow triggers from those strafe projectiles hitting enemies at a more favorable time. So this is what it really does. And some people are confused about that. Just want to get this out of the way. In general though, dual wield versus one hand and quiver versus two hand and quiver, it doesn't really matter all too much. That's kind of the beauty of this God Demon Hunter. You can wear many different combinations of weapons as long as you have all the main multipliers. And of course you want to have the Dawn in there as well somewhere. So you have the quiver equipped and you keep the Dawn and so on. So you can also do this with like a Yang's recurve even. For example, I think the T16 setup has this here. We have a Yang's, gives you extra 50% resource cost reduction. So it is like a slightly weaker DPS choice, but you have all those resources, so you can spam your smoke screen all day long. In T16 you can also spam the Shadow Power, Shadow Glide, for example. You will have no resource issues, and this also makes it quite smooth. So even in a push, if you have a good Yang's, you could use that. I didn't really put like 20 different weapon choices now in those variations here. We have the one-hand variation and the two-hand variation here. There also used to be an Odyssey setup here. This is like a very high-end build, and in Season 29, that is not recommended because you need some Paragons to survive. You can't really fit in the Guardian set, etc. So it doesn't really make much sense to play this in Season 29. But these dual wield setups, or one-handed offhand and crossbow and offhand, all these work. There are a few other choices that are really important for this build. First, the Teguk. So Teguk is the channeling gem. So you are always channeling, you're always strafing around. So it's really powerful. And then you have the Bane of the Trapped, of course. This build, in fact, doesn't even play Bane of the Stricken in a solo push. You have relatively high single target damage because it is hanging arrow, piercing the same target over and over, dealing lots of damage. You have very low AoE capability. So boss fights are just fast anyway, no matter what. So you just go to Bane of the Stricken in basically all setups. And then we also have the Focus and Restraint set, because you are constantly swapping between left click and right click, or like the strafe and hanging arrows. You can easily keep up those buffs. And also the Squirt's Necklace. So you just try to not get hit. There's not really any other useful amulet, but you have lots of smoke screen users. You are really fast, you can dodge around, and you can actually just focus on dodging enemies while you're doing damage. So that's also really great. And you can try to keep up Squirt's Necklace as much as possible. Even in a solo push, that is quite feasible, depending on the situation, depending on what elite effects is around. But you generally want to try to play around this when you can. Then for the rest of the skills here, we have the Hanging Arrow. Usually go with the Devouring Arrow, that's the cold rune, gives you more damage per pierce. There is also the option to play the Lightning Rune, the Shatter Shot, but this is mostly a Torment 16 thing. If you're like really powerful, gives you like a bit more AoE coverage, but that's it. Then you have the Strafe. There are 2 runes to use here. One is Rocket Storm, that gives you a rocket sometimes every few ticks. And this rocket can also trigger hanging arrows from the God 4-piece bonus. So basically you get like slightly more shots, but you lose 25% movement speed from the Drifting Shade rune. So in speedruns, usually go Drifting Shade, and in push, usually go Rocket Storm. because it's slightly more damage. Then we have the smoke screen. Smoke screen is just a really powerful defensive tool. Preparation, focused mind to fuel the smoke screen. Vengeance, this is permanent. If you have a Dawn with 65% and 37% cooldown reduction on the character, so you're going to try to hit that value. If you have a worse Dawn, then you want to stack up a bit more cooldown, but you really want to make sure that your Dawn is as close as possible to 65%. And we have basically one Joker slot on the skill bar. Usually, Fan of Knives is a nice defensive option, gives you extra armor. You can put a Wolf there as well. You can put a Shadow Power there if you want. You can do a Boar Companion. So there are a few options here for the last skill slot. And for the passives, there's the Cult of Weak. This is really powerful if the Bane of the Trap, triggering it. The Numbing Traps gives you 25% less damage done for enemies. And this actually triggers from the Hanging Arrow itself. So the Cold Hanging Arrow has basically a hidden 0.0 seconds chill effect that triggers the numbing traps. So you always have this up at all times, basically. Ambush, just nice offense passive, and archery. If you need any kind of defense, if you want to have awareness or leech passive or something like that, you can also swap out these two passives here for something defensive. Now for the solo speed variation, there is not really much of a difference, but you see that the weapon changes here and also the passives change a little bit. In solo speeds, you can run with a Fortis Ballista. So usually there was also like a higher end solo push version, but with the lack of paragons, this is not really going to be a thing. But in a solo speed run, Fortis Ballista just allows you to protect your Squirt's Necklace much more easily. So you don't really need like Bala or anything there. You can just run this one, and even if you take a hit here and there, you keep your Squirt's Necklace so you don't lose your damage buff. And it also just protects you. It's like a nice defensive choice on top of that. So that depends a little bit on like how you play, how your character feels. You can also just go with your push setup if you want. It's basically the same thing. Just it's there for the amulet. And then for the passives, you switch it up a little bit. So you get in Tactical Advantage for the extra speed. You can get in the Blood Vengeance for the extra resources. And you see here, you don't need like these defensive passives or something like that. In speedruns, you should be tanky enough. And when everything dies in a second, there should not be any danger. Outside of that, nothing really changes on the setups. Kind of a similar story for T16, but once you are strong enough, you can go for like even more movement speed. So you see this here, for example, there's about second Unguards, we have the Boon of the Hoarder, and you could even get like a Wrath of Lightning in there if you want to. And you can get the Shadow Power, Shadow Glide. So together with Blood Vengeance and Preparation, you can like fuel both Smoke Screen and Shadow Power and just like, you know, fly through those maps in T16. It's really fast. So there are some tweaks you can do, but for the most part, you could just take the same setup as well into T16 if you want. For the stat priorities, what you want is crit chance, crit damage wherever you can, and then your elemental rolls, so especially the cold damage on the amulet and on the bracer, and then you want to hit that 37% cooldown reduction that I mentioned with a perfect Dawn. If you don't have a perfect Dawn, then you might want to have something like 40%, etc. So that depends on the roll. Just make sure that your vengeance is permanent, and you're gonna have a much easier time staying alive, not getting vortexed around and all that stuff. And the rest of the stats is just like area damage where you can, maybe Dex Vitality, especially with the Guardian set. Those are actually good stats in Season 29, so it's much easier. You want to have movement speed on the boots. This is a novelty in Season 29 as well. You can actually have movement speed on the boots now and still put it in Paragons, and you get a bit more movement speed. And this is basically it for the stats here. Attack speed, on the other hand, is not really a good stat here, so you also don't really expect this in your Paragons. There are certain breakpoints that give you like a slightly more favorable like Hanging Arrow procs from the set, but realistically it's just not worth investing into attack speed that much to try to hit those breakpoints. Instead, you just go for other stats, and also on your Paragon distribution, you don't really invest into Paragons. Speaking of which, in Season 29 you can distribute your Paragon points wherever you want in each of the categories. You can put 200 points in any stat. Generally, you just want to try to like even out the crit as much as possible. So you want to have like kind of like a 1 to 10 ratio roughly between crit chance and crit damage. So you're just gonna put points into each of these categories until this is somewhat even, until you have like the highest damage on your sheet. Attack speed cooldown should not really be spec'd unless you really need a cooldown, maybe early on. You can invest into that, but then later on you want to get it from your items and then rather put those damage stats. For the core skills, you can go movement speed, at least in the speed builds. I think I did that. So here we have the movement speed, but since you already have so much built into the set, I just went for the extra dex here for a push at least. And for the defense, you can go for a combination of life and all res. So you already have a lot of armor, your dex class, you get armor from the dexterity, and instead you're going to try to like even out those two stats a little bit to gain more toughness. Again, this depends a bit exactly on the distribution of your stats and what you're wearing, so you might want to tweak this a little bit up and down to get the most out of this. And then for the utility, you go with full area damage, 200% area damage. Actually gives this build a little bit of like an AoE capability, but again, you know, in a push scenario, it's just really hard to eat through those big packs because you only pierce a few times with your arrows. But it does help. And then for speed variations, you can also go with a bit of pickup radius here, for example. At D16 can go even more pickup radius, you don't really need area damage there. So there is like a few tweaks here on the paragons that are made for the different setups. And that's also it for how to build this character. The gameplay, as I mentioned, is very straightforward. You just need to make sure that you always have your 20 momentum. So you want to shoot hanging arrows at least once every 9 seconds. You also want to do it 5 times at the start of a run to actually stack that momentum. But what you need to know is there is also a bug that still has not been fixed where sometimes you just don't get momentum stacks. So even if you press your hanging arrow while strafing, it may just not give you a stack and it may keep ticking down. So you have to pay a bit of attention there, or you just, you know, muscle memory, maybe press it a bit more often than every 9 seconds, just to make sure that even when the bug happens, you're still fine. The easiest way to do this for me is that I just hold down right click at all times for the strafe, and then I hold down shift at all times as well for force attack, and then I left click whenever I want. So like this, I just hold down those 2 buttons and press left click, and I get my hanging arrows out. You also want to do this to like improve your DPS a little bit. So when you are fighting, let's say for example here at the same place all the time, you don't actually have to move through the rift. You actually can improve your DPS by doing this left click like continuously every second or so. As you can see here right now, this is like the active playstyle where you can get more hanging arrows. In addition to the automatic hanging arrows, you can also cast your hanging arrows at exactly the right time with the right rhythm, and you get more DPS. But generally, if you're farming, you don't really have to do this. Everything just dies, and it's not like the craziest buff or so if you don't do this. So if you want to play this more laid back, more chill, you can just like strafe around and barely press hanging arrows just to keep up the buff. And that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this. I wish you good luck in Season 29, and see you guys next time.